I don't know if you're familiar with William Willimon, who is a professor or was a professor of theology and of Christian ministry at Duke University and at the Duke University Divinity School in North Carolina, and a Methodist minister. And as I was preparing my sermon, I came upon this story that he told. I disliked him the moment I saw him. I expect that it comes as a shock to some of you lay people to hear a pastor say that he dislikes someone in his church. Nevertheless, it is true. When I met him during my first week in that congregation, I despised him. He was loud, a braggart, probably a bully. In the first 5 minutes of conversation with him, you quickly learned that he had made a lot of money through all sorts of business shenanigans. He liked running things, and no doubt, probably wanted to run the church and to run me as well. People said he came to church only when he felt like it. He had conflict with previous pastors and would probably have conflict with me. People said he liked to make a big show of his financial success, and yet people also said that he gave very little to the church. He thought what he gave to the church gave him a license to freely criticize the church and its pastor, and of course I kept him at arm's length. While I was visiting in a nearby city, I was introduced to someone as the pastor of that church, and the person said, "Isn't that the church where John Smith is a member?" And I cautiously answered, "Yes, John is a member of the church. He is a member, though not a particularly active member," I added just to cover myself. "I'll always be indebted to John. Me and a lot of people like me," the man said. "Indebted?" I asked. "Yeah, John's the one who paid for my education. My education, and a lot of people like me. I worked in one of his businesses after school when I was in high school. My senior year in high school, I got a note from him. He hardly ever spoke to me when I would run into him at work. The note said something like this: 'I want to help you with college. You get into the best college you can, and I will see you through.' That was all. I got into good college, and he paid just about every cost of it. And I wasn't the only one. I expect that he must have footed the bill for a couple dozen other young people in town." "That's hard to believe. I don't think I have ever heard that of John," I said lamely. "And I bet you'll never will. He asked us not to tell anybody about his generosity. He said he didn't want anybody beating on his door asking for a handout. I think that the real reason is that deep down inside, he's a genuinely humble person. I do know for sure that he has sure done a lot of good in his own quiet way," the man said. "Now," says William Willimon, "I don't know about you, but I find such unrestrained generosity coming from a person like John annoying." That's right, annoying. It's annoying when those people who are not self-evidently good people, those people who are not well-informed church people, turn out to be such undeniably good people. What are we undeniably good, well-informed church people, to do with their unrestrained beneficence? Resent it, that's what. Why would Jesus work such goodness among them and not among us? Why are the demands of discipleship so easily fulfilled in their lives and not ours? Perhaps because they do not think of themselves as good. They are particularly capable of being good. Perhaps because they are not trying to be righteous. Righteousness comes so easily to them. Or perhaps a strange phenomenon. The righteousness of the not self-evidently righteous has more to do with the nature of Jesus than with the nature of people. Perhaps there is something about Jesus that tends toward the unrighteous, the not so morally virtuous, the less than good people. He did say on one occasion, and on many occasions, when he was criticized for hanging out with sinners, with prostitutes, with criminals. He said, healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners, to change their hearts and lives. In other words, if we're basking in our own goodness, what goodness could I give you? And to be honest, many of us enjoy basking in our own goodness. Perhaps because we are basking in the light of our own righteousness, it is therefore more difficult for us to receive Christ's light. I don't know, but what I do know is that there does seem to be an annoying tendency in Jesus to reach out to the lost, to work wonders among them. And there seems to be this complementary, annoying tendency of the lost to respond to the reach of Jesus. Now, Paul, in the reading today, encouraged the Philippians to model their behavior after Jesus. And do you remember back in the 90s and the words that, what would Jesus do? WWJD, it was all over the place. You know, that expression comes from a novel written by Charles Sheldon in 1896, and it's entitled In His Steps. What would Jesus do? That question helped many people discern choices that they would make. And we used it when I was involved in youth ministry a lot. Youth, when faced with making tough decisions, would weigh various factors and place Jesus within that decision, and adults did it too. Sheldon encouraged people to model their behavior after Jesus. Paul, on the other hand, reminds people what Jesus did do. What Jesus did. Look to Jesus' example. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, Paul urges the people. Paul doesn't speculate on what Jesus would do in a particular situation, but declares what Jesus did do. And in our readings, once again, Jesus is plunged into debating with the chief priests and elders within the temple. He was teaching in the temple, and the chief priests and elders were already riled up by Jesus' actions, such as having the audacity to ride into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives on the back of a donkey, and a very large crowd following after Jesus, shouting, Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven! Those words sent the entire city into turmoil, asking, who is this? And right after that, he enters the temple and he overturns the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. Jesus shouts to everyone, it's written that my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Oh, and then, to add insult to injury, he goes around curing the lame, and the children in the temple shout out, Hosanna to the Son of David. And then we're told the chief priests and scribes became angry. And they asked Jesus if he heard what people were saying. Jesus said to them, yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise for yourself? And Jesus left them and went into the city of Bethany, where he spent the night. And in the morning, he went back to the city because he was hungry, and withered a fig tree because it gave him no fruit. And he used that as a teaching moment for the disciples. See, if you have a little faith, you'll do more than that. So Jesus, again, is in the temple teaching people, and the elders and the chief priests appear. They're really trying to catch him. And the priests don't question Jesus' teaching, but are more interested as to where his authority comes from. If we look back over the last few weeks reading the context, it's also about his authority to heal, his authority to disrupt the temple grounds, and to enter Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, as a king would do. And then Jesus asks him if John's baptism came from heaven or was it human. Bam. Jesus 10, chief priests and elders 0. As they begin arguing about how to answer, and afraid of angering the crowds who believed John to be a prophet, they don't know what to say. And they talk amongst themselves that, yikes, we can't win, no matter what we say. So they answer, we don't know. And then Jesus says, and I won't tell you who gave me this authority. I'll never tell you. And I love that Jesus moves on to a parable which appears unrelated, but has a distinct connection. Because Jesus is making a strong accusation against the chief priests and elders who are present. They say the right things, but their actions speak otherwise. And the question of the parable is this: who is really doing God's will? Jesus challenges the religious leaders with a parable about two sons, one who refused to be obedient and work in the vineyard, and then he changed his mind, or the second who said he'd work in the vineyard but did not. And as I said, the parallel is between the religious leaders who claim they're righteous and have authority and challenge Jesus, and the sinful tax collectors and the prostitutes who are condemned by the religious leaders and considered never to be redeemed and forgiven. And Jesus invites those people who've sinned and have repented into the kingdom of God. Jesus is disrupting the religious authorities' understanding of the way that God works and who God is, along with their positions. Tali Sharat, who was on Hidden Brain podcast, if you're familiar with that, wrote a book, I'm Right and You're Wrong. And he says, a cognitive scientist, neuroscientist, might say the chief priests and elders suffer from confirmation bias, which is a tendency to take in only data that confirms a prior conviction and to discount information that doesn't conform to what we already believe. Confirmation bias was the reason we had crusades. It's the reason why Galileo was condemned by the Inquisition. It's also why politicians continue to debate, not listening to one another, debate about global warming. And pediatricians still have to explain vaccine safety to skeptical parents. And I'm sure you can add to that. By whose authority are we receiving information? As human beings, if we receive information that contradicts our beliefs, it's found that we will make every effort to reject the information, usually by disparaging the source. Sounds familiar? So no one gets anywhere. It's around and around. And then further studies have found that emotions, building relationships, helping people to make a connection with other people, that's what really helps, that people feel cared for and compassion. That's when lives change. And I like Willimon's story about the man John. I can relate to his struggle to like a person who gave him difficulty, and yet the other side of the person was to help others without recognition. So who did what was right? The son who said no, went into the vineyard, or the one who said yes and didn't? The one who said no, who did the will of God. And Paul reminds us to do what Jesus did and to empty ourselves and to get the work we are called to do right. To treat people fairly. If we don't agree, to try to talk to them. Or if we don't agree, to try to talk to them. And the other thing that it came up when I was reading about this, and we all know this, there are many people who do God's will and never enter a church or a synagogue or other places. They donate to charities, work in homeless shelters and food pantries. And we in the church say, how can we get these people into our church? Well, they're doing the work of the church. They're doing the will of God by reaching out beyond themselves. Millenniums, whom we often spend too much time trying to get back to the church, are the ones studies show are the most generous with their money and time in helping people. They are putting their values into action. They're doing what Jesus did. So how do we redefine the boundaries of God's vineyard, of our spaces, either in the church, outside the church, in our communities? How do we enrich our understanding of what does it mean to serve God, to be faithful? What does it mean to look at that person who doesn't look like a Christian or act like a Christian, and yet they're the most loving people? What does God ask us to do? And in Ezekiel, we're told to change our hearts and our lives. In Paul, to follow Christ in humility, to be humble, to do what Jesus did, with the help of others, and most of all, with the help of Christ. Amen.